The morning was slow and heavy, the light of the sun barely touching the window, and he opened his eyes not in a rush, but as if the weight of the night was still holding them closed. And when finally he managed to sit up, he felt the wooden floor under his feet, cool and quiet, and he remained there for a while, sitting, breathing, feeling the rhythm of his chest rising and falling, until he leaned forward and searched for his sandals, the same old pair he had left the night before near the edge of the bed, one slightly turned, the other facing the wall. And as he slipped his foot into the first sandal, he noticed how the leather was worn out, how the strap had left marks on his skin. Yet he still pressed his foot in, slowly, deliberately, almost as if the act of wearing something simple carried a meaning far greater than the object itself. And then the second sandal followed, one foot, then the other, the sound of the straps stretching softly filling the silence of the room. And after standing, he walked with small, dragging steps towards the mirror, leaning against the wall, not fixed, just leaning, slightly tilted, enough for his reflection to appear distorted at the edges. And when he looked, he saw not only his face, but the tiredness beneath his eyes, the faint lines on his forehead, and the way his hair fell in uneven directions. And so he raised his hand, combing through slowly, finger by finger, again and again, as though smoothing the strands could smooth the thoughts that had been circling since yesterday. And in that simple act, he lingered, brushing, fixing, but never really finishing, because the mirror kept showing the same weariness, the same quiet acceptance, until he stopped and looked closer at his own eyes, as if searching for a light hidden inside, a reminder of something he had once believed possible. And it was in this pause that the voice of the narrator, gentle and soft, like a whisper carried by the air, appeared, not to interrupt, but to reflect, saying, "Sometimes we forget that even in the smallest routines, in the sandals we put on, in the hair we straighten, in the mirror we observe, there are invisible threads forming, threads of attention, threads of focus, and each of these threads is what quietly weaves the reality we later step into. For wealth does not arrive in a rush, it comes silently, pulled closer by these very invisible threads." And then the voice faded, leaving only the sound of his breathing once again. And the story continued, with him bending down to splash water on his face, the cold drops striking against his skin, running down his cheeks, falling to the sink below. And he repeated the motion many times, cupping his hands, filling them, pressing the water against his skin, closing his eyes, opening them, looking at his reflection each time as if it could change. And the minutes passed in this repetition, again and again, water, skin, mirror, until his face was not more awake, but more surrendered, and he reached for the small towel that hung nearby, rough at the edges, soft in the middle, and pressed it against his cheeks, his forehead, his chin, slowly, without hurry, drying not just his face, but the weight that clung to it. And then, leaving the towel back in its place, he turned and walked to the small wooden table near the window, where a single cup waited, a cup without decoration, without shine, only plain clay. And he lifted it, filled it with water from the jug, and drank slowly, sip by sip, each drop sliding through his throat as if marking the passage of time, until the cup was empty, and he placed it back down with the same care he had lifted it, as though every object had its own rhythm, its own quiet presence, and sitting back down, he stared through the window. The outside world bathed in the faint glow of morning, and in that stillness, nothing happened, and yet everything was happening, because the silence itself was filling him with a quiet strength, a strength that whispered, abundance is always approaching, always closer than you believe, and though you do not see it, the invisible current is already moving toward you. Just as surely as the morning sun moves across the sky, he stood again and chose a shirt without hurry, the one folded at the top of the stack with the slightly frayed collar and the small loose thread near the third button. And he lifted it, shook it once, twice, 3 times, as if to wake the fabric, and then slid one arm in and then the other, feeling the coolness of the cotton against his skin, aligning the shoulders, smoothing the creases with the palm of his hand, and he buttoned it slowly, top to bottom, one circle of plastic through one slit of thread, a pause between each, as if each button were a tiny decision placed carefully in time. And when he reached the last one, he checked them all again with his fingertips, counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, as if the counting itself could steady his breath. And then he reached for his trousers, dark and clean, and eased one leg in, then the other, pulling them up inch by inch, feeling the familiar resistance of the waistband before fastening the clasp. And only then did he bow to lace his shoes, the laces worn to a dull softness, crossing them over, looping, pulling, then repeating the same measured ritual on the other foot, the bow centered, the ends even, and he stood a moment to look at the result. Not proudly, not critically, but with a simple awareness that each ordinary movement was a choice, and every choice was a vibration, and every vibration was a message quietly sent to the universe. And here the narrator's voice returned, soft and slow, reminding not just him, but you, the listener, that this story is inspired by the teachings of Abraham Hicks. And they often say that everything begins with alignment, that wealth and clarity do not arrive because you chase them, but because you align yourself with the feeling of already having them. And as you hear this, I ask you, gently, are you noticing the details of your own routine, the way you choose, the way you breathe, the way you focus? Because in those simple acts, you are broadcasting signals that call forth the life you are about to live. And then the voice withdrew again, leaving him to continue, walking slowly to the small window where he tied back the curtain with a loose ribbon, the fabric heavy in his hands. And the light poured in, brighter now, golden across the wooden floor. And he stood still, breathing it in, letting the warmth touch his face, his chest. And he thought for a moment how this golden light felt like abundance itself, invisible yet undeniable. And perhaps you feel it too as you listen. That sense of an unseen current moving closer, not because you demanded it, but because you allowed it, because you listened, because you became soft enough to let it in. And as he lingered in the sunlight, his hand resting on the curtain, the silence itself seemed to whisper, there are invisible currents pulling riches toward you, even now, even as you sit, even as you breathe, even as you listen. And he closed his eyes to trust it a little more, to surrender a little deeper, while the room grew brighter, and the day, though ordinary, was quietly filling itself with extraordinary promise. He stepped away from the window and moved toward the small wooden table where the bread rested, covered by a cloth that smelled faintly of flour and warmth. And he pulled the chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor in a sound that seemed longer than it really was. And he sat, placing both hands flat on the table, feeling the uneven surface beneath his palms. And for a long while, he did nothing but breathe. One breath in, one breath out, noticing how the chest expanded, how the shoulders rose and fell, and when finally he lifted the cloth, he revealed a loaf. Simple, plain, yet carrying the work of unseen hands, and he broke it apart gently, piece by piece, the crumbs scattering across the wood, and he chewed, slowly, as if every bite contained not just food, but the reminder that abundance is not always grand. Sometimes it is in the smallest portions. Sometimes it is in the quiet ability to taste, to receive, to allow. And while he chewed, the narrator's voice returned, calm and unhurried, saying to you, dear listener, Abraham Hicks always reminds us that abundance is not about what is missing, but about tuning to what is already here. And in this moment, as you listen to the sound of chewing, to the rhythm of silence between words, you too can shift your focus from lack to presence, from hunger to fulfillment, from waiting to allowing. Because when you appreciate even the smallest detail, you call in the larger streams of prosperity. And then the voice faded again, leaving him alone with the bread and the sound of his own swallowing. And after finishing, he brushed the crumbs with his hand, slowly, one direction, then the other, watching them fall like tiny seeds onto the floor. And he stood again, carrying the empty plate to the basin, rinsing it with a thin stream of water, turning it in his hand, letting the drops slide down the ceramic before placing it back in its place. And he dried his fingers on the cloth hanging by the wall, pressing each finger separately, one by one, until they were dry. And then he walked outside, opening the door with both hands, the hinges groaning slightly, and the air outside rushed in, cool and filled with a scent of earth. And as he stepped across the threshold, the morning was no longer dim, but bright, and he paused, standing still, his eyes adjusting to the wide expanse before him, the hill rolling downward, the sky stretching endlessly, and he inhaled deeply, as if he could swallow the entire horizon. And in that moment, the narrator returned, whispering again to you. Perhaps you too can pause and breathe with him. Perhaps you too can notice that the same sky above him is the same sky above you. And in that vastness lies proof that there is no limit, no shortage, only expansion. And just as Abraham Hicks teaches, when you stand in appreciation, you open yourself to currents unseen, currents that already carry everything you have ever asked for. And perhaps, as you listen, you can feel those currents now, moving softly toward you like invisible rivers of light. He stepped fully outside, and the ground beneath his shoes felt uneven. The stones pressed lightly against the soles, and he walked slowly, each step deliberate, each step followed by a pause, as if the world itself asked him to move without rush. And as he descended the path along the hill, the grass brushed against his ankles, whispering in soft strokes, and the morning wind tugged at his shirt, filling it like a sail. And he adjusted the collar with his fingers, smoothing it down again and again, repeating the same gesture as though repetition itself gave him comfort. And he continued downward until he reached a small patch where the soil was softer, and he bent to pick up a single stone, smooth and pale, and he turned it in, his palm feeling its weight, feeling its texture, holding it as if it contained a secret. And in that quiet act, he smiled faintly, for even the smallest stone carried a story of time, of pressure, of transformation. And as he held it, the narrator's voice came back, soft and steady, telling you that Abraham Hicks teaches that everything you see, even a stone, is evidence of energy focused, energy accumulated, energy turned into form. And when you understand this, you begin to see that wealth is not a sudden arrival. It is the slow shaping of invisible energy into visible reality. And as you listen, perhaps you too can look at the small things in your life, the unnoticed objects, the repeating moments, and feel them as proof that the universe is always arranging, always molding, always aligning things on your behalf. And then the voice faded once again, leaving only the sound of birds above, their wings flapping in the wide open sky, and he continued his walk, placing the stone back gently on the ground, almost bowing to it before moving forward. And the path narrowed, twisting between bushes, and each branch brushed against his sleeves, leaving faint marks of dust. And he stopped to dust them off with long strokes of his hand, over and over, careful, methodical. And when he reached a wooden bench, old and leaning to one side, he sat down heavily, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and he rested his elbows on his knees, folding his hands together, staring at the valley below, where fields stretched endlessly, rows of crops catching the sunlight in quiet gleams. And he sat there, unmoving, only breathing, watching, absorbing, until the narrator returned once more, speaking gently to you, and perhaps you feel it as he does, that life is never asking you to hurry. It is only asking you to allow, and allowing is the art of wealth. It is the art of softening the mind enough to receive what has already been sent. And if you can rest in that thought, even for a breath, you align yourself with currents so powerful they can move mountains quietly into place. And he sat still, letting that thought sink into the silence, as though the very air around him had slowed its rhythm to remind him that prosperity flows where peace is kept. And he closed his eyes and let the wind move across his face, steady, gentle, infinite. He remained on the bench for a long time, the wood pressing into the back of his legs, the weight of his body sinking deeper as though the bench itself wanted to hold him there. And after a while he leaned forward, letting his hands trace the rough edges of the seat, the splinters catching against his fingertips, and he rubbed them slowly, again and again, as if memorizing every ridge. And then he rose, the sound of a creak echoing behind him, and he began to walk once more, the path stretching into the valley, narrow at first, and then widening, leading him past small trees whose leaves shifted like tiny mirrors in the light. And he touched the branches with the back of his hand, brushing against each one as if to greet them, pausing often to watch how the leaves trembled and then stilled. And as he moved further, he reached a stream, the water thin but steady, flowing with a rhythm that seemed endless. And he crouched, cupping his hands to drink. The water cooled against his palms, sliding down between his fingers. And as he drank, he thought of how something so clear and simple could feel like a gift. And in that moment, the narrator returned, quiet but certain, speaking to you, the listener, reminding you that Abraham Hicks often speaks about the stream, about going with the current rather than against it, about easing into the flow of life instead of pushing against it. And as you hear these words, perhaps you too can notice where you are resisting. Perhaps you too can feel how much easier it is to float with the water than to struggle upstream, because prosperity is like the stream, always flowing, always present, waiting for you to dip your hands in and receive. And then the voice faded again, leaving him crouched, watching the ripples stretch outward, circles within circles, disappearing into the banks. And he dipped his hands again, splashing his face, the drops clinging to his skin, running down his jaw, dripping onto the soil. And he repeated this 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, until the rhythm became a kind of prayer. And then he stood, wiping his face with a sleeve of his shirt, dampening the fabric, pressing it against his cheek again and again, before stepping carefully over the stones that lined the stream, 1 foot balancing, then the other, until he reached the far side. And he paused to look back at the water, standing still, breathing slowly, as though even the act of crossing had meaning. And further along the path, he saw a figure in the distance, a woman walking slowly, her basket resting on her hip. And as they drew closer, neither spoke, but when she passed, she lifted her eyes for a moment, offering the faintest nod, and he returned it with the smallest smile, and they continued on, each in silence. But the moment carried weight, a reminder that every encounter is an exchange of energy, seen or unseen. And again the narrator whispered, gently to you, and perhaps you too have noticed that abundance often arrives in the simplest of meetings, in the smallest gestures, because when you align with the vibration of receiving, life finds endless ways to deliver, through people, through glances, through silence itself. And as he continued walking, he felt lighter, as though the air had shifted around him, carrying him forward, guiding him without force, only ease, step after step, toward something not yet seen but already felt. He followed the path as it widened, the ground beneath his shoes turning from stone to soil, softer with each step. And his pace slowed, not because he was tired, but because the world seemed to ask him to notice more, to see more, to feel more. And he obeyed, pausing often to watch the sway of tall grass, to listen to the hidden insects moving inside, to notice how the sun filtered through the branches above, scattering patches of light and shadow across his shirt. And as he walked further, he reached an open field, wide and quiet, where the horizon stretched endlessly. And he stood at the edge of it, breathing deeply, letting the air fill not just his lungs, but his entire chest, his arms, even his fingers. And he raised his hands for a moment, palms open, to the sky, then lowered them again, slowly, as if performing a gesture no one taught him, but he had always known. And in the middle of that field was a single tree, tall and strong, its roots pushing through the ground, its branches stretched like arms pointing in every direction. And he walked toward it step by step, circling around its trunk once, then twice, before sitting down at its base, resting his back against the bark, feeling its roughness pressing into his shirt. And he closed his eyes, tilting his head upward. And for a long time he did nothing but sit, hearing the wind move through the leaves, hearing the faint buzz of life that filled the air. And then the narrator returned, calm and certain, telling you that Abraham Hicks teaches the importance of alignment, and alignment is nothing more than resting yourself in a place where you feel good, where you feel present, where you feel whole. And as you listen, perhaps you can imagine yourself under this same tree. Perhaps you can let the image of its roots remind you that you too are rooted, supported, connected, and that its branches are your possibilities, reaching outward in every direction, infinite, unstoppable. And if you can allow yourself to feel even a drop of peace in this vision, you have already stepped into the vibration of wealth, because wealth is not only numbers, it is the expansion of your being into trust, into calm, into knowing. And the voice faded again, leaving only the sound of the leaves, a soft and endless whisper above. And he remained there, tracing the lines of the bark with his fingers, following each groove, each crack, as though reading a language carved by time. And he leaned his head back further, closing his eyes tighter, breathing slower. And he imagined that every breath he took was pulled from the air itself, full of something invisible yet nourishing. And as he stayed there, a deep stillness settled, the kind of stillness that feels heavy and light all at once, and time seemed to dissolve, minutes stretching into hours, though nothing was measured, and the field, the sky, the tree, and his own body blended together as though all of it was one single presence, unbroken, eternal. He stayed beneath the tree until the shadows stretched long across the field, the air cooling, slowly brushing against his skin with the quiet touch of evening. And finally he opened his eyes, stood, and brushed the dust from his trousers with slow, careful strokes, one hand, then the other, repeating the movement until not a speck seemed to remain. And he began to walk back along the path, his pace unhurried, his steps almost weightless, as though the earth itself carried him forward. And when he reached the top of the hill, he paused, turning to look at the valley below one last time, the fields glowing in the fading light, the stream glistening in silver threads, the bench leaning to one side, the small stone he had once held still lying where he left it. And he breathed deeply, allowing the whole day to settle inside him like a soft echo. And as he stood there, the narrator returned, no longer just a whisper, but steady and present, speaking not only to him, but to you, dear listener, reminding you that the story you have heard is inspired by the teachings of Abraham Hicks, teachings that tell us again and again that what we attract is a mirror of what we feel, that the universe responds not to words or effort, but to vibration. And tonight, as you listen, your vibration is softening. Your vibration is rising. Your vibration is aligning with the truth of who you are. And who you are is already prosperous, already whole, already worthy. And as you breathe now, I invite you to imagine invisible currents surrounding you, pulling gently at the edges of your life, pulling opportunities, pulling ideas, pulling connections closer and closer, like threads weaving themselves into a tapestry you cannot yet see, but will soon live. And I remind you, as Abraham Hicks so often says, you never get it done, and you cannot get it wrong. So you can rest, you can trust, you can allow. And as you let these words drift deeper, you may feel the weight of the day lifting, the resistance dissolving, and the quiet certainty of abundance taking its place. And as you lie there, perhaps with your eyes closed, perhaps with your breath slowing. I tell you that prosperity is not something you chase, just something you allow. It is something that comes quietly while you rest, while you soften, while you sleep. And so let your thoughts quiet, let your body release, let your heart open. For you are already aligned with more than you can measure. And it is all flowing to you now, silently, endlessly, gently. And if by chance you are still awake, if your eyes have not yet closed, I invite you to leave a comment saying, I am still awake, so that I know you have traveled with me through this story. But if you are drifting, if you are floating towards sleep, then let the story carry you further. And if you are awake still, then let us continue with yet another story, for the night is long, and the current of abundance never ends. And if your eyes are still open, if your breath has not yet carried you completely into sleep, then let us move together into another story, soft and gentle, continuing the current of abundance that never ends. And this story begins in a small village where the houses leaned close to one another, their roofs tiled with red clay, their windows glowing faintly in the dim light of lanterns. And in this village there lived a man who was known, not for wealth or power, but for the way he walked every evening to the same fountain in the square, a fountain carved from stone, its water flowing endlessly, quietly, as if it had no beginning and no end. And each night he would sit at the edge of that fountain, dipping his hand into the water, lifting it, watching the drops fall back again, repeating the act again and again until the ripples spread outward in circles that touched the entire pool. And the villagers often wondered why he did this, but he never explained, for he knew that the secret was not in the water itself, but in the rhythm, in the stillness, in the focus of his attention. And as he sat there night after night, he began to notice something strange, that the more he allowed himself to feel peace in those moments, the more unexpected things began to appear in his life. A coin on the ground, a neighbor offering bread, an old friend returning with news of opportunity, and the narrator's voice comes to you again, reminding you that this story too is inspired by the teachings of Abraham Hicks. For they often say that what you focus on expands, and this man was not focused on lack. He was focused on rhythm, on flow, on allowing, and from that place, prosperity found him again. And as you listen, perhaps you too can imagine yourself by that fountain, your hand in the water, your thoughts softening, your heart opening. Because every time you allow yourself to rest in appreciation, you are summoning invisible currents that pull toward you the very things you once thought were far away. And the man continued his ritual, night after night, never asking, never demanding, only allowing, and his life unfolded quietly in ways he could not have predicted. And now, as you rest with this image, you may find yourself ready to drift deeper, or if you are still awake, we may wander even further into yet another story. For the stream of abundance has no end, and neither does the night. The man returned to the fountain each evening as the village quieted, the sounds of footsteps fading, doors closing, lamps flickering one by one, until only the soft trickle of water remained, and he walked the same path with the same pace, his sandals pressing the dust, his shadow stretching behind him in the golden light of dusk. And when he arrived, he sat in the same spot, the stone cold against his legs, and he leaned forward, dipping his hand into the water again, lifting it, watching the drops fall in slow arcs back into the pool. And he repeated this countless times, each gesture like a heartbeat, steady and certain, and the villagers began to say that he must be waiting for something, that he must be praying for something, that perhaps he was asking the fountain for wealth or love or health. But he never told them what he felt, for in truth he was not asking, he was aligning, and though he could not put it into words, he knew that every drop of water reflected something far greater than itself. Each ripple a reminder of an unseen order moving outward endlessly. And as he sat there one evening with the moon rising above the rooftops, the narrator returned to you, soft and patient, telling you that Abraham Hicks reminds us again and again that it is not the asking that brings the answer, but the alignment. Not the pushing that brings abundance, but the ease. And as you hear these words, perhaps you can imagine yourself at the fountain too. Not needing to explain, not needing to push, only resting, only repeating, only allowing. And in that repetition, something within you grows still, something within you softens, and in that softness, you find yourself closer to the vibration of wealth than never before. And when he finally stood to leave, brushing the dust from his hands, adjusting his robe across his shoulders, he felt lighter, as though he had been given something, though nothing visible had changed. And as he walked back through the village, the lanterns seemed brighter, the air felt fresher, and even the narrow streets looked wider. And without knowing how, he realized that the wealth he thought was far away was already flowing toward him, like the endless water of the fountain, steady, quiet, unstoppable. And as you listen, you may feel that same current now, invisible but real, moving closer, carrying with it what you have been ready to receive all along. The days passed, and still he returned to the fountain. Every evening, as the sun dropped lower and the air grew cooler, his footsteps tracing the same familiar line through the streets, the dust rising faintly behind him. And when he arrived, he sat in silence, dipping his hand once more, lifting, releasing, watching the drops fall, and repeating the same gesture again and again. And though nothing seemed different to the eyes of the villagers, inside him everything was shifting. For he began to notice that each day small gifts appeared, sometimes a stranger offering fruit, sometimes a child handing him a flower, sometimes a neighbor waving with a smile warmer than before. And he did not force these moments. He did not ask for them. They simply appeared like leaves carried on a current, floating easily toward him. And one evening, as he leaned forward, his hand cupping the water, the narrator returned, calm and certain, speaking to you now, reminding you that Abraham Hicks teaches the path of least resistance, that everything you desire is already ready for you, already waiting, and your only work is to soften, to ease, to step into the stream instead of fighting against it. And perhaps you can feel that now, as though you too are sitting at the fountain, the water cool against your skin, the ripples moving outward, carrying invisible messages of abundance in every direction. And as you let yourself rest in this thought, perhaps you notice how your body feels lighter, how your breath moves more freely, how your heart opens quietly to receive. And the man at the fountain remained for hours that night, the moon higher than before, the stars bright above him. And when finally he stood to leave, he walked back through the village with steps that felt guided, as though the earth itself smoothed the path before him. And in his chest he carried a certainty he could not explain. That prosperity was no longer something to chase. It was something he was already inside of. Just as fish are inside the water, just as birds are inside the sky. And as you hear these words, you too are inside prosperity already, breathing it, living it, waiting only to notice it more clearly. And in this noticing, more and more of it flows to you, endlessly, quietly, like the fountain that never stops. That evening came just as the others had, the light fading gently, from gold into blue, the air carrying the scent of bread cooling in ovens, of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. And once more his sandals pressed into the familiar path. The same stones, the same turns, the same dust rising softly behind him. And though it was the same, it never felt the same, for each step carried a different silence, a different breath. And when he arrived at the fountain, he lowered himself carefully onto the stone edge, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes tracing the ripples that never ceased. And he leaned forward, dipping his hand, lifting, releasing, watching the water fall back, watching the circles spread outward, repeating the gesture slowly, endlessly, as though time itself had stopped measuring. And as he repeated the act, he felt his body soften, his shoulders sink, his breath deepen, and the thoughts that once scattered now slowed, settling like sand drifting to the bottom of a clear pool. And he thought to himself without words that nothing was missing, nothing had ever been missing. And as this thought pulsed through him, the narrator returned to you, soft and steady. Saying Abraham Hicks often remind us that when you stop pushing against what is, when you stop holding the vibration of lack, the stream of well-being rushes toward you with more force than you can imagine. And perhaps you can feel it now. Perhaps you too can sense the stream around you, invisible yet undeniable, carrying ideas, carrying people, carrying wealth, carrying clarity, always flowing, never stopping, waiting only for you to relax enough to notice it. And as you imagine the stream, perhaps you notice how your breath eases, how your body releases, how your mind becomes quiet. And in that quiet, you are aligned. And alignment is the key to everything you have ever wanted. And the man continued, his hand dipping, lifting, releasing, again and again, the motion becoming less his own and more the fountain's, till it was as if he and the water were the same. And the longer he sat, the more he noticed small details, the way the moonlight clung to the surface of the water, the way a single leaf floated gently, then turned slowly before disappearing into the current, the way the air seemed to hum softly, as though the night itself was alive. And he smiled faintly, because he understood that wealth was not something distant. It was already here, woven into every detail, flowing through every drop. And when finally he stood, brushing the dust from his robe with long, deliberate strokes, he felt lighter, steadier, as though he carried the fountain within him now. And as he walked home, the path seemed smoother, the lanterns seemed brighter, and even the silence of the sleeping village seemed to sing with promise. And the narrator whispered once more to you, dear listener, telling you that as you rest here, tonight, you too are sitting at your own fountain, and your repetition is your breath, in and out, in and out, each cycle summoning more, each breath aligning you deeper. And as you continue to breathe, you are calling in abundance more surely. Then you know and you need not force it. You need only allow, for what you seek is already on its way, and the current of prosperity is already moving toward you now. The morning came quietly, the first light of dawn touching the rooftops of the village, the air still cool, carrying the faint scent of dew resting on the earth, and the man rose, slowly from his bed, his movements unhurried, his body heavy yet calm, and he slipped once more into his sandals, adjusting the straps carefully, one foot, then the other, pressing down, tightening, loosening, repeating the action until it felt just right, and he smoothed his robe over his knees, straightening the folds, pulling the belt around his waist, tying, untying, and tying again, each not deliberate, each not steady. And when he looked at his reflection, and the man rose slowly from his bed, his movements unhurried, his body heavy yet calm, and he slipped once more into his sandals, adjusting the straps carefully, one foot, then the other, pressing down, tightening, loosening, repeating the action until it felt just right, and he smoothed his robe over his knees, straightening the folds, pulling the belt around his waist, tying, untying, and tying again, each not deliberate, each not steady. And when he looked at his reflection in the small piece of polished metal near the wall, he noticed not the weariness in his eyes, but a softness, a clarity, a quiet glow that had not been there before. And though nothing had changed outwardly, everything had shifted inwardly. And as he stepped into the streets of the village, the neighbors greeted him differently. One with a wave, another with a smile, another with a loaf of bread pressed into his hands without a word, and he accepted each gesture slowly, nodding, bowing slightly, holding the bread with both hands as though it were treasure. And he walked on, noticing how the shopkeepers seemed warmer, how the air itself seemed lighter, how the children playing paused to look at him with curiosity. And as he moved through these simple moments, he understood that his fountain practice was not separate from life. It was life itself, and the narrator's voice returned gently to you, reminding you that Abraham Hicks teaches that alignment is not only felt in meditation, it is carried into the world. And when you are aligned, the world rearranges. People respond differently. Opportunities arrive, doors open. And perhaps, as you listen now, you too can feel how the universe is already rearranging on your behalf. Small shifts, small gestures, small signs that the current is flowing in your favor. And the man carried his bread home, setting it on the table, breaking it into pieces with slow hands, chewing one bite, then another, each mouthful quiet, deliberate, filled with the awareness that nothing was missing, that everything was arriving in its own time. And as he ate, he looked out the window and saw the sunlight striking the fountain in the square, the water glistening like silver. And he knew that he would return again that evening, not to ask, not to demand, but to sit, to dip his hand, to feel the current, to remember that abundance was already within him. And as you hear this, perhaps you too can remember. Perhaps you too can trust that your practice of listening, of breathing, of allowing is enough. And perhaps you can close your eyes now, letting your breath slow, letting your body soften, letting the stream of well-being carry you into deeper rest, into deeper alignment, into deeper knowing that prosperity is flowing toward you even now, gently, endlessly, quietly. If you're still awake, Stay here with us. Open our special playlist now and keep listening to more sleep stories for mental reprogramming and prosperity. Listen to one, then another, until sleep gently arrives and carries you into the night. And if, by any chance, your eyes are still open, leave a comment with the words, "I'm awake, so." I'll know you stayed with me until the very end. I'd also love to know, what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts and let's talk in the comments. I'll see you in the next video. And until then, may your dreams be filled with light, abundance, and peace. Good night and sweet dreams.